Welcome back to Button Pushers. We're going to continue our conversation with Rebecca Millman Marsh on why patient shielding should be done away with. So let's get some historical background.
So people have been talking about shielding male gonads for quite a while, actually, since towards the beginning of the 20th century, there was some mention of it. And then around the 1950s, people started publishing more papers and publishing different designs for gonadal shielding. And the issue gained traction. And the major concern, actually, the only concern that's cited, is the risk of inducing hereditary effects. The idea being that radiation exposure to the gonads will cause cellular changes and mutations that will be passed down to the patient's offspring. And that was based on fruit fly experiments that had been done primarily during the 1920s. And that did show that large amounts of radiation can cause hereditary effects in fruit flies. But the first main difference is that we're talking about much larger amounts of radiation. The second thing is that they're talking about fruit flies. And humans have evolved on a planet that has background radiation. Humans have evolved and developed cellular repair mechanisms that deal with some damage to DNA. The life expectancy of a fruit fly is very, very short. So from an evolutionary standpoint, there really isn't a reason for them to develop those same repair mechanisms. If you have, I actually don't remember what the lifespan of a fruit fly is, but it's very short. If you're only going to live for a week, then, being able to repair DNA is really not on the top of the list of things that are going to give you an evolutionary advantage. So anyway, enough about fruit flies. So that was one part of it. But in reality, if we look at it now, we now have over 70 years of data on atomic bomb survivors who have been followed very, very closely. And there's just no evidence of hereditary effects from radiation. And there's a paper published more recently, even over the last year, that looked at whether or not there were hereditary effects from people who lived near Chernobyl in the mid-'80s. And again, they found that there's just no evidence that there were any hereditary effects.
Wow.
And one of the things that really stands out is that there are some estimates after Chernobyl, and this is relevant to the conversation, I promise. After Chernobyl, there was such a fear of radiation that there were a lot of pregnant women who had abortions because of the fear of hereditary effects, or because of the fear of effects on the fetus. And it's estimated that up to 1 million abortions were performed.
Oh my gosh.
And that is an example of there is a real risk to overestimating the risk from some of these things. And we saw the same thing after the nuclear power plant issue in Fukushima. It is estimated that there are more people who got sick and who died because they were displaced, because they were told they had to move out of a certain that part of Japan, than any risk that they would have faced from the radiation exposure. And so overestimating these risks has real and tangible consequences too.
Yeah, you mentioned in your thing that you're in your article that they haven't redone their wording since 1976 or something like that. And that's like crazy. This is a science-based field, and we're like, this information from 75 is still relevant. It's like, serious?
Well, what's even more
according to their recommendations, people probably should have been using gonadal shielding to watch TV at that time. You know what I mean?
I don't want to put the idea out there. No. Well, what's also interesting is because of course, a lot of this, in terms of make practical changes, a lot of states, almost every state has a X-ray regulation that addresses gonadal shielding. Now, over the last couple of years, I know of 11 states now actually that have either issued variances or changed their regulations to allow specifically allow facilities to not shield patients. All of them always had the caveat in there before that you were supposed to use gonadal shielding unless it would interfere with the quality of the exam. But it's interesting too, because if you go through a surprisingly large number of those state regs, have that wording in there similar to what the FDA wording is, but then they also list tissue weighting factors for various tissues, and the tissue weighting factors that are in there are the same tissue weighting factors that were from 1976, and those tissue weighting factors have been updated twice, most recently in early 2000s, 2007 I think. And so they weren't updated in the 1990s. They weren't updated in 2007. Wow. And so if you look at that, and I'm kind of looking at that, I'm like, wait a minute. So the gonadal shielding policies haven't been changed. The other sort of factual information about tissue weighting factors, which I shouldn't say factual information, but the published tissue weighting factors haven't changed since then. I'm like, so what's the deal? Like, how do we move things along and at least try to get some of these things updated?
Well, and you mentioned too that there's a huge difference in how our techniques are, the way that we're taking x-rays. I mean, I learned a little bit on film, but then I immediately went to CR and DR. And if I used the same techniques that I used back when I used film, I'd be, oversaturating all of my film. So there's that too, the fact that our doses have really gone down, and yet we haven't done anything to change how we're protecting the patients. And we proposed last week, instead of time distance shielding, it should be time distance collimation, because collimation is really changing the game in terms of how much scatter radiation occurs.
And I think that it's important to keep in mind too, that there's, of course, the changes in detector technology, and that's made a big difference too. But there are FDA requirements for the minimum amount of beam filtration. So we measure, one of the things that physicists measure on an annual basis is half value layer of that X-ray beam. So it has to, the beam has to have a certain hardness. And so it has to have a certain amount of inherent filtration, so that the purpose of which is to reduce those lower energy X-rays that are contributing to patient dose, but not ever reaching the detector. So they're not contributing to image formation. That wasn't the case in the 1970s.
I think as a tech, one of the things I'm really hearing and I feel kind of convicted of right now is, I think for me, if I'm really honest, lead shielding, gonadal shielding was like duct tape. It was really simple, and it provided an apparent solution. Maybe I could get my car to the shop, if I just put this duct tape over it. Like maybe I can help the patient a little bit if I just throw this lead shielding on their lap, right? Whereas if I really did due diligence and understood things, I would need to go back and hit the textbooks, because I started out in film too, and actually learn what the heck digital is doing, and how different it is from film, how I need to change my techniques accordingly. I need to learn more about half value layer, I've learned a lot about it since, but I know that there are techs practicing in this field who have no clue what that is. Like, I'm going to have to add in information about half value layer in this video. And I'm not trying to be mean, but it's much easier to just throw some duct tape on it than to do due diligence as a professional and say, oh, I need to figure out, like, how those tissue weighting factors have changed. Is this machine the better machine for this patient, or is this other machine better because it has, I know that it's got a better beam on it,
When you mention techniques, like what about the 15% rule? How often do we see people actually applying the 15% rule? They see their green number and they're like, it's good to go, I'm done. Yeah. You're not done. You can make it better.
Well, and that's another thing that I think that historically, I won't focus on historically. I think that moving forward, I think that the medical imaging community could do a much better job of communicating some of these changes and providing appropriate materials to summarize the points that are important clinically, and the ones that, probably that aren't as important. And personally, I don't think it matters if technologists can draw out circuit diagrams.
Yes.
It really, but what is much more important, in my opinion, is that you're looking at entrance exposure and these deviation indices and everything on these digital systems, really understanding what those mean.
Yeah.
And I think that with the move to digital, there was not as good communication in terms of how is this actually and practically going to impact clinical practice, and how can we optimize the use of these systems? How can we optimize the use of this technology? And, the system can spit out be a little green range or yellow range and spit out this deviation index number, but those also have to be set up properly. And if they're not, then that number doesn't mean anything whatsoever. And there are always caveats. There are reasons if that number may not represent what you think it's going to represent. If you have a large, if you have a patient with implants, metallic implants of any sort, then that deviation index is going to be, I don't want to say inaccurate, but it doesn't mean the same thing as if you have an image that fully covers, that's fully occupied by lungs. And I think that's one thing that I wish I could figure out how to kind of bridge that gap. Yeah. And before, I know I mentioned there's a lot of aspects of what rad techs do that I know nothing about, and that most medical physicists know very little or nothing about. But this is one area where we do know a lot about it. And the question is, there's no reason for us to be like, okay, well, we know all this information about the stuff that you're using. How do we better disseminate that? How do we better work with vendors and with rad techs and with rad tech education programs and say, what are ways that we can help you? What is there, would it be helpful to have a quick cheat sheet kind of thing about, reminders that are in the clinic about what that deviation index means, what some of these other things do and what they don't do. And that I have not been successful in doing. I don't know how to do that.
Well, I feel like a lot of our availability to CEUs, a lot of them are on these abstract diseases that you never see and these weird things. And it's like, hey, that's cool and interesting. But how often do we see articles on digital radiography and how to actually optimize our technique and patient care? And I feel like that's a starting point. Like we all are required to do continual education credits. We need to be applying that education towards things that matter. I don't know about you guys, but when my facility went from CR to DR, there was no training. I mean, right. Yeah, Philips came in and showed us how to use the machine, but they only explained it to the level that they did. And that's like, overload of information to begin with. I just took the information that I remembered from that 2-day training and that's the information I had. And when I started teaching, I had to do a whole bunch of research on digital to be able to understand it, to be able to teach it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't know. I kind of feel like there's the medical physics community should be able to be a better resource for those sorts of things and should be able to work better with the rad tech community and say, what can we do to help? What's going to be useful? Nobody wants to sit through and read another textbook about digital radiography. Yes. I mean, whatever. That's not what do it. Well, most people don't.
Yeah, no. Oh, really? Oh, that's hard.
Especially the 20-year-old students, they don't.
And so the question is, what can we do to help? Mm-hmm. Or because maybe the answer is we don't want your help, but I think that it's those sorts of collaborations and relationships that I think that the medical imaging community has not taken full advantage.